In this video we're going to focus on how law and order was enforced throughout the early modern period. We're specifically looking at the years approximately between 1500 and 1750. And straight away it's important to emphasise that things continue to be the same from the medieval period, and things also change with regards to law enforcement. And by that we're talking about how law was actually upheld. So let's focus on, first of all, what stayed the same. So what stayed the same throughout this period is this notion that there was still no paid police force. So all communities, essentially, they continued to police themselves. However, they actually still needed to rely upon key people like those parish constables and justice of the peace, but we'll talk about that shortly. There was a new development, however. As towns grew inside, watchmen were employed. Now, these watchmen, they were actually employed to patrol the streets of the villages and towns. This is where they would actually ensure that there was no major drunkenness or any fighting and things like that. So this role of the watchman was a new role that certainly changed in comparison to the medieval period. Furthermore, what also stayed the same is that the people and the local constable continue to raise hue and cry. This links with this point here, with regards to how there is still no paid police force, so the king had to rely on ordinary people. However, interestingly, the role of the justice of the peace, it grew in importance. It had a role in medieval times, but we'll see in this video how that actually grew in stature and importance. Furthermore, what continued to be the same is this concept that law enforcement, it was still administered by unpaid people. People generally volunteered, although they did have some expenses that they could claim back. But a major aspect of what changed in this period is that the assize and the quarter sessions, they, if we remember when exploring medieval law enforcement, they were some of the key components of how investigations were held in courts. The assize and the quarter sessions, they increased in importance, whilst the church and manor courts declined in importance. So that's an important difference. The assize and the quarter sessions, we'll explore that further in the following slides. An important feature of this period was the increasing role of the justice of the peace. So let's meet him. So there are certain factors that we need to remember. And what's important is that he was actually appointed by the king. So he was part of an early formation of central governments involved in law and order. So remember, he was appointed by the king. Now, originally they were called the guardians of the peace, and that gives you some indication of their role, actually. It's a better term to understand than the justice of the peace. So the guardians of the peace was their original name. Now, interestingly enough, they were also known as magistrates. And these magistrates here, that is the term that's used nowadays for those people who keep law and order at a local level. So the magistrates of the 21st century comes from the role of the justice of the peace, and they dealt with the petty crimes, those less than 12D. And they also did jobs that local councils do today. So at the marketplace, they were the people who would check the weights and measures. So if some vegetables or some kind of spice was being purchased and a customer asked for a certain amount of them in weight, the justice of the peace was the person who would make sure everything's in order and everything's above board, so to speak. And they would have other roles like issuing licenses for pubs. What's really important is that during this period, the role of the justice of the peace became central to maintaining law and order at a local level. So at a local level, the quarter sessions where the justice of the peace would sit, they replaced the manor courts. So these quarter sessions there, where petty crimes were heard, essentially minor crimes less than 12D, that's where they were held during the 1500s to approximately 1750 in the quarter sessions. That's in contrast to the assize courts. Now, the assize courts is where the capital offences were held, and those were the offences which resulted in the death penalty. Essentially, the serious crimes such as murder and theft over 12D, rape and robbery. So let's just be clear about that. Assize courts were for the serious crimes, and the quarter sessions were for the petty crimes. It's essential that we focus on the community within 1500 to 1750 because this has an overall impact on the effectiveness of law and order. And a key problem with the fact that law and order was largely based around unprofessional, unpaid people is that some local officials were actually criminals and troublemakers themselves. Essentially, many of them were corrupt. They would accept bribes and they were involved in crime themselves. And the system largely relied on wealthy people. So many wealthy individuals would accept a role of maybe a year or two where they would help to police the local communities. But that was a problem because increasingly the rich reported the poor much more frequently throughout this period. A conflict began to emerge between the rich people and the local ordinary peasants and ordinary villagers, and this made it so that many systems were tipped against ordinary people because of the influence of the wealthy. So let's look at pressing save and a summary of the key points here that we need to remember. There is a strong element of continuity throughout this period from the medieval time, or even though there were changes. Remember, there was no paid police force, and they continued to rely on ordinary and wealthy people. There was a change, however, in the court system, and the major changes revolved around the role of the assize courts and the so-called quarter sessions. This increased in their importance, and the role of the manor and church courts actually went down. So remember, the assize courts, they were the ones now where the serious, known as capital offences, those offences which would result in death, that's where they would be held, whereas the quarter sessions would be led and facilitated by the Justice of the Peace. Remember, the role of the Justice of the Peace became much more prominent during this era. The JP, they were the person who would make rulings on local crimes in the quarter sessions, and they were for essentially the petty crimes, those below 12D.